Welcome to the Existential Empath Podcast. My name is Tanya, and I am an intuitive empath. My intention is to share valuable tips, tools, and techniques that I have learned so you can tap into your own inner healer naturally and intuitively. Welcome back, everyone. Today I have guest Sandie Byrne. Sandie is an Irish psychic medium born into generations of readers and has been providing accurate readings for more than 27 years. She has been voted Ireland's Medium of the Year. And in 2022, Sandie received the Irish Enterprise Award for Best Psychic and Medium Readings. Sandie is also the host of the podcast, Life After Life, where she answers questions about all topics around spirit communication, Irish lore, and afterlife. Welcome, Sandie. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. And you
Yes.
make me, it makes me sound very old when you say that I've been reading for 27 years. But yes, I have.
No, it sounds very
seasoned
seasoned and very distinguished.
It does. I've actually technically supposed to be reading longer because my grandmother taught me to read tea leaves when I was just 5 years old.
Oh my gosh, tea leaves. We can talk about that too. That's super cool. I've never had tea leaves read. And so, oh my gosh, I've been really excited about this show. So everyone out there, Sandie and I tried to plan this show a few days ago, and we were both sitting in our computers, but for some reason, the universe was not allowing us to connect. And so we are here today, and we are really excited. And we are going to talk about generational mediumship and how intuitive traits get passed down the family line. And so, Sandie, I was reading a little bit about you, and you grew up with a grandmother and a great-grandmother who were both readers. In fact, generations before them, they were readers too. And so you have quite a long lineage of psychic mediums in your family tree. So can you briefly share your story about your intuitive abilities and how they have been passed down your family line?
Absolutely. And I suppose while we can say that they were passed down my family line, I have to tell people that I don't believe that that makes you any more susceptible to communicating with spirits. And I see you're nodding, so you agree. I think it's just that when it's in your family or there's an understanding in your family, they can tend to pick up on it sooner, or they understand what you're talking about. Whereas people who don't have that spiritual background, they're kind of thinking, what's my child talking about,
Or as a child, like, what am I going through? And my parents don't understand,
Exactly, absolutely. So my grandmother, Mary O'Brien was her name. She unfortunately passed away when I was just 7 years old. She was only 56 when she passed. So she used to read tea leaves, but being an Irish Catholic family, she had 10 children. So she didn't necessarily have time to do many readings publicly. But she used to read for friends and friends and friends and stuff like that. It was her mother, my great-grandmother, who was still living when I was born. She was, I suppose, the most famous, if you like, in our family. And she was Ellen Keating, or we would say here in Tipperary, Caton. The name is Keating, but we would pronounce it Caton. And so she had a little cottage outside of a village called Dundrum in County Tipperary. And people used to queue up outside her house from like 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning to get their palms read. She used to read palms, and she used to connect with spirit as well. So, and I'm always saying to people, with regards to readings, like when people read, and you can go to whatever psychic or medium you want, the readings are the same, but the way people read you are different. And I use my family as a representation of that. So when I started to read people psychically, my grandmother taught me to read tea leaves when I was just 5 years old. And my grandmother had learned to read from her mother, who used to read palms. Oh. And my great-grandmother had learned to read from my great-great-grandmother, who used to read bones and stones. It was a very old way of reading. Like the Dolly Parton song, These Old Bones, that song.
I'm so reading these old bones.
Like that. Yeah, exactly. So each of us learned to read from the generation before us. So the readings are the same, but the tools that we use is different. Personally, I love my tarot cards. But, and my husband, he qualified originally as an electrician, but he's a perpetual student. But he cringes when I say this. You know, you can change a plug and you can use a screwdriver or a butter knife. You know, they both do the same job. You know, the end result is the same. And it's the same with readings. So, you know, if any of your listeners are ever looking to have a reading, don't necessarily be drawn by, unless they have a particular preference, but don't be drawn by the fact that someone used cards or someone uses tea leaves or whatever. I even met a gentleman when I was working in Canada that holds people's hair, you know, to read them. So it's just whatever way they get your energy, you know, but it shouldn't alter the reading in any way. You should be more drawn to the person who's reading you.
Absolutely.
But anyway,
sorry,
yeah, I digress a lot when I'm talking, so please put me back on track.
No, I love that. And so, Sandie, when you're reading tea leaves, is there a specific type of tea that you would use, a specific leaf, or is it really any of them?
Anymore. I don't read tea leaves anymore.
But when you
used to when I was a little girl. No, it was just whatever people had. You know, it's just years ago I did a course on how to read psychically, you know, and on this course we used tissues. So the lady that was giving the session, she took a brand new box of tissues, opened them in front of us, and we each pulled a new tissue from the box. And while she was talking to us for about a period of 10 or 15 minutes, we held the tissue in a little ball in our hand. At the end of her talk, we had to pass the tissue to the person on our left, and that person read us just from the tissue.
Wow.
Okay. So it just goes to prove that the cards or the tea leaves or whatever, they're a way of connecting with somebody's energy. Now, I'm going to say this to you, although I did say this when I was interviewed on Canadian television. I had a lot of psychics writing to me afterwards, but I can only speak from my own experience of reading people. It doesn't matter what someone's reading, but what you're doing by using the cards or the tea leaves or whatever is you're taking their attention away. Okay. When I used to have people come into my home years ago for readings, I used to have like crystals on my desk, little bits and pieces. So when somebody would come in, instead of sitting there with their arms folded and their stoic face on, they would be looking like, oh, that's a pretty color. And what does this crystal do? And the minute their energy was, you know, diverted somewhere else, it was immediately open. You know, because they weren't concentrating on closing the energy. Exactly. And that's, you know, if any of your listeners have ever been to a show, the first thing the person on stage will say is, you know, unfold your feet, unfold your arms, open your energy. And that's what you need to concentrate on more than the tools that the psychic is using.
That's powerful. Yeah. And I agree with that, because when I do sessions with intuitive sessions with people as well, it's like, you know, are your legs crossed or your arms crossed? Let's open yourself up, because oftentimes too, especially skeptics, when they go to get a reading, they'll just kind of sit there with their arms crossed in the chair. And, you know, I've recognized that too. So Sandie, when you say that you're doing a reading, how does the information come through to you? Is it coming through clairvoyance, clairaudience, all the above? How is it coming through?
So, you know that we all use a little bit of everything, you know, but mainly I'm both clairvoyant and clairsentient. Okay. I'm actually very lucky in the fact that, and, you know, I would have always been closer to my mother's side of the family, but both from my grandmother, who we already spoke about, and my grandfather, who was married, obviously, to my grandmother, his family were also readers. Oh, wow. So I got clairvoyance from one side and clairsentience from the other side. So I have both, and I can use both in my readings. So yeah, it's mainly what I feel from people and, you know, obviously what they show me in my head. So people always imagine when you talk about clairvoyance, and I'm sure your readers are familiar with all the terms, but just in case they're not, clairvoyance, clair means clear, and voyance is the French word for seeing. So clairvoyance is clear seeing. Clairsentience is clear feeling. So it's I see and I feel the energy of spirit. So when you say to somebody that you see spirit, they always imagine that you see a person like standing beside them or in the room with them or something. And you know that it doesn't necessarily happen like that. It's mainly what they show you in your head. Okay, so they'll put thoughts, they'll put pictures, they'll put little video clips or whatever into your head. So sometimes you know stuff and you don't know why you know it. Or sometimes you say stuff and you don't know why you say it. It just comes out. And thankfully, so far, I'm touching wood while I say this, but it's always been right. Okay. So you have to learn to trust it. And if you have any baby mediums, as we call them, in the learning stage, which to be fair, we always all are, because nobody knows everything. But, you know, it's just all about trust, you know, just trust what you're getting and say it. You know, don't be worried about being wrong. If you're worried about being wrong, you'll never be right. Yeah. So you just have to trust what you're getting and say it. Yeah, so for me, it's clairvoyance and clairsentience, but we always get little bits of everything. And if we talk about clairaudience, which is clear hearing for a minute, so you know, people always think that clairaudience is about hearing the voice of someone's loved one from spirit, and it's not necessarily. It could be any sound. Okay, so where I live, as I say, I used to see people at my home years ago. I don't anymore, but I did have a lady that came for a reading once, and I would never have said that I was clairaudient, but she was, you know, she was very stoic. She wasn't necessarily, you know, very au fait with the whole process, and she was a bit nervous. Okay, it turns out she'd lost her husband, so I can appreciate the nervousness and, you know, the emotion that was flying. But we were sitting here. Now, I don't live on a flight path. Okay, I don't live at all on a flight path. But that day when she was sitting in front of me, we were there, we were just getting into the reading. Next thing, a plane flew so low over my house that the house actually shook. Now, I'm in a house in the middle of the countryside. There's no house beside me. And the house literally shook, and the noise, we couldn't even hear each other talking with the noise of this plane. And I got a fright because, like I said, you know, we never have planes. So I got up and I went to the window. There was no plane there. And I said to her, she felt it too, and she heard it too. And I said to her, I said, was your husband a pilot? And she went white, and her husband was an airline pilot. So clairsentience isn't always about hearing, you know, the voice of somebody. Now you can, and I've often heard, you know, people's voices. Do I have time to tell you another story about that?
Yeah, that's fun. And, you know, Sandie, clairaudience is one of my powerful ones. So I can completely resonate with that. It is when that voice, it can be a voice, it can be a sound, it can be anything that comes through, and it can be powerful.
So when I was, and I would never have said that I was clairvoyant or clairaudient, because, you know, I did. And especially when I was younger, I thought it was about just hearing somebody whispering in your ear. And
which is
I keep saying to spirit, yeah, I keep saying to spirit, like, this would be so much easier if you just whisper in my ear, you know, because people think it's so easy, and it's not necessarily.
Sometimes they do. I can hear music. I've heard angelic music that I know is not being played, but I know I'm hearing in other dimensions. Yeah.
Yes. When I was little, I have an aunt and uncle that lived in a village called Holy Cross, which is only about 7 kilometers from where I live. But there's an abbey there that's about 1,200 years old. It was opened by monks 1,200 years ago, and it's still standing. They still have mass there every day. But when I was little, I used to hear the monks singing, and I always thought that monks lived upstairs, because I thought everybody could hear the monks singing, but monks haven't lived there in about 1,000 years, you know? So, you know, I could always hear things, but I didn't realize that they weren't there. But when I was 17 years old, I was living in Germany, and I was out for a run one day. I used to be very fit when I was young, and I was out running one day, and I lived in the middle of Bavaria. There was nothing around except vineyards for miles and miles and miles around. So I was out running, and it was really quiet. And I remember it was back in the 1990s. I don't mind telling you, I had a beautiful personal stereo on, if you remember those, with the orange earphones. And I was listening to Simon. Huh?
The Walkman.
The Walkman, absolutely. We used to call them personal stereos. And I was listening to Simon and Garfunkel, and the next thing I just heard this voice shout, "Run," you know? And being me, I thought, okay, well, there's someone behind me now taking the piss, you know, if I'm allowed to say that, or making fun of me. And I looked around, and there was nobody there. Okay. So I thought, okay, well, someone's making fun of me now. They're hiding in the vineyard or something. So I kept running, and then I heard this, "Run like feck." We have a saying in Ireland that we use feck. So run like feck. And I was like, okay, well, something's going on here. So I stopped, and I took off my headphones, and I literally did a 360 in the road. And I was like, where is this voice coming from? And next thing, this car drove past, right? Nobody went on this road, but this car drove past, and I can still remember, you know, when you see something and it's like slow motion.
Yeah.
And there was 5 guys in this car, and the music was like doof, 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 doof. You know, Germans love their rock music. And they looked at me, and I looked at them, and next thing they drove past, and they kept going. So I thought, okay, well, they're gone. I'm going to stay going. And next thing I heard this shouting, "Run, run now." So I ran into the vineyard, and I hid between 2 rows of vines. And I thought, okay, well, I'm so glad nobody can see me, because I feel really stupid now. Okay. The car came back, and these 5 guys got out. Oh. And I'm not joking you. I could hear my heart thumping. I thought, okay, my goose is cooked. I'm gone. I'm a goner. They spent 20 minutes searching around. They knew I'd hidden somewhere. Oh. And they were speaking German, and I could understand some of it, but literally I couldn't hear what they were saying, because all I could hear was my heart thumping in my chest. after about 20 minutes, one of these guys was about 2 meters away from me when I thought, okay, I'm going to run. But then the guy that was up on the road called him back. He must have thought I'd gone or whatever. So when they took off, I waited another 15 or 20 minutes, and then I ran home through the fields. I didn't go back up to the road. But I remember reading a story about an American girl years later who had heard a similar voice. She'd taken we call it a lift, you call it a ride, from a guy in a truck. Mm-hmm. And when they stopped at a gas station, when she went into the ladies' room, when she was washing her hands, she heard a voice telling her to climb out the window and go. And she thought it was really stupid. And she said she heard this voice 3 or 4 times and she didn't, because she said, I'd have had to climb up in the sink to climb out the window. She said, I thought, this is really stupid. I must be hallucinating. So she didn't climb out the window and go. And that guy kept her for 8 years before she went. Oh my goodness. And I often thought over the years, when I was 17, I obviously didn't think much about it, because when you're 17, you don't know about the dangers. We didn't have the internet back then, you know, so we didn't hear stories of trafficking and stuff. But I knew something was wrong. But if I hadn't heard that voice, my life could have been totally different. So yeah, so with people, I would always say, if you hear something like that, trust it.
Absolutely. You know? And when it comes through, I noticed that too, when it could come through as a whisper, and then when it gets louder, and then it gets louder, and it's like, all right, it's really trying to draw my attention in. I need to listen to that intuitive voice.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yes, 100%. So yeah, so that's the clairaudience obviously is one of the ways that we can connect. But we all, as you say, even though you would say that your superpower, as I call it, is clairaudience, you would use other modalities as well, you know, to bring spirit through. We'll take what we can get. Yeah. And you know, what people don't understand is that it depends on the personality of their loved ones in spirit. How did they communicate when they were alive? Mm-hmm. You know, because and it helps them to pick out the right medium for them too. Because if you have a loved one in spirit that was shy when they were alive, don't forget that, you know, a shy person doesn't talk to strangers, and your medium's a stranger. So maybe going to somebody that's clairaudient wouldn't be the best if your loved one was shy. Maybe going to somebody that was clairsentient or clairvoyant would be better. So you should always give it some thought, you know, not necessarily just go to somebody because somebody else went and they found them brilliant. It depends on your loved one.
Yeah, and don't write it off. If you've been to one psychic medium, give another one a shot, because they're all very different in how they read. Yeah. I know for me, I've been to several, and I've had very different experiences with each and every one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's the experience we want. You know, we can get information from our loved ones, and it's lovely and it's so comforting. But I think every time you meet somebody different, they have a different approach, a different outlook. And I'm not an expert, but I learn something every time I meet somebody new, and I love it. You know, I absolutely do. Yeah.
So, Sandie, you
said
I was just going to say your grandfather's side as well had readers. Yes. Did the readers in your family, were they all the women, or were they both men and women?
No, it was actually my grandfather's father. So my great-grandfather, that used to do a lot of the reading in my grandfather's side of the family. So where they lived actually was right beside a fairy fort, which we can talk about as well.
Ooh, yeah.
Because when my great-grandmother on my granddad's side married my great-granddad and moved to the farm with him, she got caught overnight in a fairy fort. Okay, so we can talk about that in a few minutes. But yeah, he also used to be the person that used to prepare bodies for burial. So back in the day, we wouldn't have had undertakers in every Irish village. So my great-grandfather used to be that person. And he also used to see the banshee, which is another Irish thing that we can talk about. So the banshee is like a spirit that warns you of death. Mm-hmm. And he used to see the banshee. So he would always know that somebody had died before, because they didn't have a phone in their cottage, right? You know, it was like way back when. And so he would always know that someone had died, and he would be ready to go to prepare their body before the priest came to tell him that there was a passing in the village. So that was his little party trick. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I worked around the dead for 20 plus years. My family owned the funeral home in town, you know, which was in the home. So I do feel sometimes there is a correlation between working with the dead and psychic mediumship. At least I've recognized that with, not every psychic medium, has that correlation, but many of them do. It's like we feel very comfortable with that.
Yeah. Oh, totally. In Ireland, I think we would probably be more au fait with, being around dead people, because it's something that we do. I mean, the Irish Wake is very famous, that, we're around the body for 3 or 4 days after death. So, even when relatives would have passed when I was younger, even children, we were always around the dead. We drew pictures for them. We made cards for them. We did all this, and it was a very natural thing to be around dead people. So I don't know, is that the same in American culture? But it would have been, yeah.
In the Catholic culture, yes, they do the wake. Most of the funerals in the Catholic culture. So why do they call it a wake? Is there a story behind that?
Yeah, because years ago, before, modern medicine, sometimes people would have been in a coma, or they would be having some kind of a fit, and they weren't actually dead, but they may have been pronounced dead. And a lot of people used to be buried alive. So they started holding the body for a couple of days in case they woke up, hence the wake. So that's where the term came from. So even though in Ireland we would be very quick to bury our dead, you're always buried within 2 or 3 days. But mostly nowadays, I mean, there are funeral homes and some people choose that, but it's much more common now to keep the person at home up until they leave to be buried or cremated.
Oh, that's interesting.
So we have the wake.
Yeah, I know that the term dead ringer came from that time frame too, because when they would bury someone, they would put a bell, and there would be someone who would be out in the cemeteries. If they would hear the bell, then they would dig the person up, which is terrifying to even think about. And you wonder, I have serious claustrophobic issues, and I'm like, was I one of those ones who was buried?
I know, it's mad, isn't it? Right, to think, when you think of how terrified those people must have been, it's scary.
It's terrifying. And so, Sandie, I want to dive into this, because coming from Ireland, which is regarded as very mystical and magical, and I've got to say, when I visited, I felt that connection to the land. You've been communicating with spirit ever since you were a child, and I have been too. I've communicated with animals, I've communicated with the elementals, and I've also communicated what I call the tree people. I don't really know how else to explain it, but can you tell us a little bit more about the mysticism and the lore, like you talked about the banshee and the fairy forts that come with Ireland?
Yeah, and I don't know why, and I'd imagine, even that a lot of stuff was taken over, like, Halloween, that's an Irish festival. It was brought to America by the Irish. The pumpkin is very American, because we don't have pumpkins here. We have now, they're imported, but we didn't used to have pumpkins here. We used to carve turnips, which, if you Google it, it's much more scary looking than a pumpkin. But that's actually a very Irish festival. And I did a whole episode on the podcast, about Halloween and where all the different customs come from. So all those kind of things, do come from Ireland, and a lot of them going back to the Druid times. So the fairy fort, I think, is one that's often talked about, because we're very superstitious when it comes to our fairy forts, and they are all over the place. I have one now. My back garden is literally a field. Okay, I live in the countryside, but in the field behind our house, there's a fairy fort. And I tell you, the hunt often passes by here. So every weekend there's a hunt, whether you believe in it or not, I think it's quite cruel, but they hunt foxes, on horseback. Yeah. And they have like hounds and everything. But there a few weeks ago, a fox ran into the fairy fort to get away from the hunt. The dogs or the horses wouldn't go in there because they felt the energy from the fairy fort. So the fairy fort, so there's ring forts and fairy forts. Ring forts are man-made structures, okay? They were built like way back hundreds and hundreds of years ago to protect the animals from the elements, okay? This is Ireland, we have a lot of wind and rain, okay? So they built the ring forts, and when they were abandoned, they were also taken over by fairies. But a natural fairy fort is generally, I say a circular kind of, it might be oval or slightly square, but it's a piece of vegetation, if you like, generally trees or shrubbery. And this is the crossover point between, our physical world and the fairy world. And it's considered very bad luck to cut them down or to, encroach on them, in any way, shape or form. And, such is the belief that, even roads and motorways have been rerouted to avoid knocking down fairy forts. And my husband, years ago, he was working on, it's only really, people from Ireland, it's only really probably in the last 30 years that we have a lot of motorways here. They were all very small roads. And about 20 years ago, my husband was working on the plans for a new motorway that was being built over in the west. And there was a ferry fort, and the engineer, I think he was British, and he wanted to knock down the ferry fort to move, to build the road through it. And everybody downed tools. Nobody would do this, And he said, well, if you won't do it, I'm going to bring in a crew from the UK and we're going to knock down this ferry fort. And that guy died very suddenly over the weekend. He just died. And so the ferry fort wasn't knocked down. It was built around. Do you remember, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, a movie called Back to the Future?
Of course, yes.
Yeah. Do you remember the car with the doors that went up, the DeLorean?
Yep, the DeLorean.
Yeah. So I don't know if you know that those cars were made in Ireland.
No, I didn't.
In the north of Ireland, they were made in Belfast. And at the time they were featured in the film, it was a very small operation, and they used the car for the film, and then they became super popular, right? So they needed a new factory to build the extra cars that people were ordering after the film. So they built a new factory, but in order to build this factory, they knocked down a ferry fort, and they built on the site of the ferry fort. And do you ever see a DeLorean car now? No. The company went wallop. No, the company went wallop after the new factory opened. Wow. Yeah, because they built on a ferry fort. So nobody will build on a ferry fort now. Nobody will touch them or move them.
So how big are these? How big are these ferry forts?
They can be any size, but generally they're small enough. The one in the field at the back of us is probably about, I'm guessing now, maybe 12 foot by 10 foot, something around that size.
Okay.
So it's quite small. But there are bigger ones. There's different sizes. I mean, they're all over the countryside. So you could be going past, like there's a farm down the road from us that I used to play in when I was little. And we call one of these fields the 40-acre field because it's 40 acres, right? But right in the center of this field, there's a ferry fort. And they will plow around it. They'll sow around it. They'll reap, cut silage around it. They will not touch the ferry fort. No.
So what happens if you go in one? What happens if you sit in one or you walk in one?
It's frozen. I don't know, because I never have done. And I won't.
I've heard stories of people going missing around ferry forts.
Yeah, they say. I mean, people go missing that haven't been in ferry forts either. It's more bad luck per se than anything else. Like farmers who would have disturbed ferry forts, they've come out the following day and found animals dead in their fields and stuff. So yeah, people just don't mess with them anymore. As I said, my great grandmother, when she married my granddad and moved to their farm years ago, she was helping out. So they were cutting the hay, in a very old fashioned way with the scythe and whatever. And she was going around with an Essen cart and she was collecting up all the, the hay from around the edges. And she stayed in there after dusk, and so when you do that, you can't find the way out. So she had to sleep in there overnight until the sun came up the following day. Yeah. Because the fairies keep moving the exit because you're not supposed to be in there.
Oh, wow. I live in the Pacific Northwest and I do a lot of Sasquatch research, Bigfoot, and there's a lot of that here. And they build these huge structures. I mean, rip trees out of the ground, roots in the sky. They look like an asterisk, so I've got a lot of photos of these structures. And I always ask permission before I go into one. I'll sit back and listen intuitively, and we'll leave gifts, some tobacco or maybe some rose quartz, clear quartz, different things. And they'll gift us back, we'll go back to these structures. And so it kind of reminds me of that, is that, when we're working with these elementals, they want to be respected too. They're a part of the land. They've been on the land before we've even been on the land. And so it's really neat that the Irish really know how to respect the fairy forts. I didn't even realize that they were that predominant and that people were like, oh no, we're not going to touch that area. We're going to work around it.
Oh no, 100%. There's just been so many, bad experiences over the years. And even when I was a little girl, because my grandparents used to live in a cottage out in the countryside, not that far actually from where we built our house. And we used to go out playing there was we call it woods, you might call it a forest. We used to go out playing in the woods, and my grandmother would always be, so specific about telling us where we could and couldn't go and not to go into these certain places. because, you know, it comes down through the generations. You can't go online anywhere and find out, okay, well, I can't go into this field because there's a fairy fort there. But, you know, the local people will tell you, don't go in there. Yeah, definitely.
So what about the stories of the leprechauns and some of the puka, I think is called, some of the other more mischievous type lore in Ireland?
Yeah, that is, it's just legend, really. It's not, you know, I mean, I think we all know that there are no leprechauns, but yeah, and I think the leprechauns kind of came about. I don't know, I'm not an expert in it, but I think that they came around as, you know, a sidekick, if you like, of the fairies or the fairy stories made for children or whatever. You know, there is a lovely children's movie called Darby O'Gill and the Little People. Have you ever seen it?
I don't think so.
So you know, it's quite old. One of the stars is Sean Connery before he ever became James Bond. You know, it was one of his first movies here in Ireland, and so it's about the leprechauns and that. But it really is legend. You know, we don't see leprechauns or dance with them or anything, but
yeah,
and we do dress up like leprechauns.
Because I know when I visited Norway, they have a lot of trolls, and they have lots of legends and stories about the boulders that are covered in moss, how they'll turn into trolls at night, and they'll see them move around, you know. And so I was curious, you travel to Europe, and there's a lot of different fairy tales and lore around these different forest people, little people. Now here in Idaho and Montana, Washington, we've actually had experiences with what we call the little people, these people that have they're very small, like 3 foot tall. They wear like a fur, and they're very quick. And so I wonder if maybe the leprechaun, you know, kind of stems back from some of these, what we have over here in the States known as the forest people or the little people. Now they hide very well, you know, I mean, they can really blend in with the forest. And so I don't know, it's just, maybe it's just the same. It's just different terminology that we use across the world, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of, you know, the lore, as you call it, it would be similar across Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, because we're all Celts. So if we take the Banshee, for example, okay, so everything that you hear about in Ireland is an anglicized name. So, you know, when we weren't allowed to speak Irish anymore, all the names were changed to something anglicized, you know, an English version of the Irish names. So the Banshee actually comes from Banshida, which, you know, is the Irish term. It means like an old fairy. And, you know, we have the Banshee here in Ireland. They have different versions of it in Wales and in Scotland as well. But effectively, it's the same thing. So in Ireland, the Banshee, she is a spirit that is seen, as she's said, to follow people with O or Mac in their name. Okay. So, but effectively all Irish people have O in their name. Yeah, because I mean, technically my name is O'Byrne, but we don't tend to use it. Well, it was illegal to use it when the British ruled, you see, so a lot of people dropped the O.
Oh wow.
But yeah, so O'Byrne, of course, that's my married name. My family name then would be O'Brien. And Mac is just like, O just means son of, okay, and women would be Ni, which would be daughter of, and it's the same with Mac, which would mostly be Scottish, which would be son of, and Fitz as well. If you Fitzgerald, Fitzgibbon, all that, that's also son of. So she's supposed to follow anybody with O or Mac in the name, okay? So basically you will hear her either crying or singing, and some people see her. She's supposed to be a spirit with very long hair, and she combs her hair, you know, outside your window, and she only appears when there's going to be a death in the family.
Okay.
So when you see or hear the Banshee, it's a warning of death. So as I said, my great granddad used to see her all the time, so he would know when there would be a death. I've heard her a couple of times. Unfortunately, yes, you know, before somebody passed, but I've never seen her. But in Scotland, they have another version of her, and she is a washerwoman. I can't remember what they call her, but she is seen by any body of water, rivers, lakes, or whatever, washing soldiers' uniforms. So, you know, when the soldiers would come back from battle and there would be blood all over their uniforms, so she washes the uniforms. But to see her now is a sign that someone's going to die. Wow. So, yeah, so not necessarily considered unlucky. I mean, families are going to have deaths in it, but it's just like a precursor that someone is going to die. So there, I mean, there's lots of different, you know, folklore. Some people don't believe in the banshee; they think it's a legend and stuff. I do. I believe. I strongly believe in it because I've had experience. I think when we experience something, we're definitely going to believe it. Okay, but it's very hard to explain to somebody who's never experienced it. You know, that this can happen or will happen or what it means. You know, people say, "Oh, you've just heard of fox or whatever." And I'm like, no, this is no fox. You know the difference. When you've grown up the countryside, you know the difference.
Yeah. And that's so true, Sandie, because people will say that to me and my team and, you know, oh, the Bigfoot doesn't exist. I'm like, when you experience the sound of the whoop and the wail and you feel it in every cell of your body, when you hear the mind speak, when you see them, you will believe. But yet here, everybody's out to get proof. And so they're very good at hiding. They don't want to be seen. They're really only seen. They show themselves to people that they know have a good intent and a good heart and aren't trying to kill them or trying to expose them or trying to, you know, whatever. And so I'm sure that a lot of the elemental spirits and all of these other, you know, what we call fairy tales and whatnot, they're just in a different vibration. They're in a different frequency. And that a lot of times not all of us can pick up on that unless we tune into it.
Well, you have to be open, and, you know, any kind of spiritual work, mediumship, even healing and stuff, you have to be open to other energies. And what you find is that the majority of people aren't. Now, you know, I'd like to think I'm not very old. I was born in 1974. So if you think I did most of my growing up throughout the 1980s, early 90s. So even back then, you know, we used to sit around and talk about stuff, which people don't do anymore. And, you know, my grandmother and my great grandmother and all our neighbors and everything, and they used to share lots of stories and experiences that they had with different things. So whether it was the banshee, whether it was the fairies, whether it was spirit, you know, and that's how we learned a lot, you know, because as a child, I used to see spirit. And I used to have a best friend, but I used to call him my best friend. So he's a little spirit boy. I didn't know he was a spirit boy. I just thought he was a little boy. And for some reason, it was perfectly obvious that a strange woman would bring him into my bedroom every night and put him into bed beside me. But nonetheless, that used to happen. And then I used to always say to my mother that the lady used to sit on top of my wardrobe and watch us both sleep all night. Aww. And then she would come and take the little boy away before my mother came in to get us up in the morning. And, you know, that was with me for years until I got to a certain age. But my point is that because I think we used to talk a lot about stuff, and, you know, my family had a lot of experience with spirit and communicating with spirit, that, you know, they understood. And they never said, oh, you must have been dreaming, pet, or, you know, that couldn't have happened, or were you thinking of a film that you saw on the television or whatever, you know. And no, it was literally, I can still picture this little boy that used to come in every single night into my room. And he left obviously when I got to that age. We always talk about that age where logic kicks in and kids know that they're not supposed to see, you know, not everybody can see what you're seeing. So I kind of pushed him away at that point. But he was such a comfort to me when I was a little girl, you know. And also, I have a theory. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but my mother lost 4 babies. And I often think that this is a brother of mine, you know, that used to come and sleep with me and look out for me and stuff. Yeah. So I like to think that, but I suppose until I cross over, I'll probably never know for sure.
Yeah, that's really sweet. And I do think as children, we're so in tune to that. And I was the same. I would have full-blown conversations with animals, and then I'd go to school and tell my friends, and they're like, what are you talking about? You're weird, you know, you're crazy. And so I started to shut it off, or I would just do it on my own. And over time, that ability went away. And now as an adult, I've started to really hone in on that ability again, because I know I was really good at it when I was a kid. I could speak. I was like Snow White, you know, I was talking to every animal in the backyard. And
a whisperer.
And so I do think as children, we're very in tune with that. So Sandie, you actually work with people whose children are intuitive, or you assist them in, you know, kind of developing those abilities. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, people often come to me because I suppose I talk a lot about my experience growing up, because I want people to understand that this isn't, it's not strange. It's actually very normal. Like, I don't believe in, imaginary friends. I believe that these are spirit that are around children. So people generally, it's not that I necessarily have a program or anything, but people just come to me for advice when they say my child is seeing this or my child is explaining that. And it's really just, and it's not a paid for service or anything. I'm more than happy to help if a child is struggling with what they're seeing or what they're experiencing, But what I say to most parents is listen to them. Okay, don't, even if you just say, okay, I don't have time now, pet, but can we sit down and discuss this evening or whatever, or get them, if they're very young, get them to draw a picture of it or whatever. But you need to be their memory for them, because the children will forget it. They'll forget what they've experienced and forget what they see. So try and write down some bullet points in a notebook or a journal and keep it for them for when they're older, so that they can understand that they have been experiencing this, because this is so important. And these things tend to tie in with who they are or how their life is going to be, So yeah, people do seek me out at that, but probably because I've spoken a lot, I think, about my experience growing up, because I did push away spirit for a long time. And people talk about it being scary. I was never scared by spirit, but when I used to push them away, kind of in my teens, because teenagers don't want to be different. They don't want to see and hear things other teenagers don't see and hear. So I didn't want to communicate with them. So like my spirit guide used to come into my bedroom and used to pull off the covers and used to knock over my pictures and just shake my bed. I was the youngest in the family, so I got the smallest room with the little single bed, and they used to shake the bed and everything. So like that used to scare me. But like once I started communicating with them, like that all stopped. It's really just somebody trying to get your attention. And one other thing that I will say to somebody, if their child is having some experience or they're telling you that they're seeing somebody, the majority of the time, I would say 90% of the time, it's their own relatives in spirit that they're seeing. So what my mother used to do was put out pictures around the house. She didn't used to say, is this the person you saw or is that the person you saw? But she used to put out pictures of her relatives around the house and see, did I recognize them? And it might take me a few days. I'm not very observant when it comes to decor and things like that, but it used to take me a few days. But then I thought, oh, that's the woman that I saw last week, or that's the man that would be on the stairs or whatever. And they were always relatives, always people that I knew or that were in the family. So I would say that to people, put up pictures of relatives. If your children are talking about somebody, there's a 90% chance that's a relative. So just put up a picture. Like my granddad, my own granddad, I call him the love of my life, because I was raised by a single mother. So he was like my father figure, and I still love him to bits. But he passed when I was 14, but he had cancer and he came to live with us when he was ill. So he died. We converted one of the downstairs rooms into a bedroom for him because he couldn't manage the stairs. And he died in that room. That never freaked us out or anything. But when my sister, as I say, we were only teenagers, but when my sister had a baby some years later, and when she used to bring that little girl into my mother's house, she always used to sit in the corner where the head of my granddad's bed was. And she'd spend hours there. And she used to always say, playing with the man in the corner.
Aww.
And I know my granddad was a military man. He was over 6 foot tall, but he used to sit on the floor for hours and talk to us and play with us. So I have no doubt that this was my granddad playing with her, So I would say to people, just listen to your child. There's enough people in this world that will tell your child to shut up and stop talking nonsense. You don't need to be one of them. Listen to them, because they're opening their heart to you.
Yeah, really they're so intuitive. I mean, for me, I wasn't necessarily seeing people spirits. I was seeing faces on trees. I was seeing the trees walking. I was seeing all of these other things that I didn't know how to explain. And I thought it was normal. I thought that the fern had a voice. I thought that the tree had a voice. I had, so I lived in a little cabin. And you mentioned this, your grandmother lived outside of town. Your grandfather lived on a farm outside of town. I think there's something to be said about living outside of town. We lived outside of town on a river. And I do think our intuitive abilities get tuned in and turned on a lot faster because we spend a lot of time in nature. I know I was like you, I grew up in the 80s too. all we did was we were outside. Mom was always kicking us outside, like, go play.
Yeah.
Well, of course we're tuning in to the energy of the land. I mean, it was just very natural for us to do that.
Oh, I miss those days. We used to be gone from sun up to sundown. She would say, come home before it gets dark, and we would eat crab apples and wild berries all day. We'd never come home for dinner. It was just amazing. But yeah, I totally agree with you. And I don't know if you've ever read a book. I always recommend this book to anybody. It's not the best written book that you will ever find, but I think it's an amazing story. And it's called 7 Steps to Eternity. And it's written by a guy called Stephen Turoff, who is a British medium and healer. But there is a chapter, you remind me of a chapter in that book where it's the story of a young boy who was killed he's a boy, I think he was about 19 or 20. He was killed in the Battle of the Somme. And it's his story as told to the medium about life in spirit. And there's one chapter where he meets this guy who works in the garden all the time. And he talks to the flowers, and he talks to the trees, and they talk back. Yes. So what you're doing is just the earthly, side of that. He looks after them in spirit, but you look after them and communicate with them here. And I firmly believe that, that there is a presence in all of these things. I mean, like, if you look at them and the history, I wish I could talk to them, because I put up a picture on my Instagram there a few weeks back of a tree that I used to sit underneath. When I was a little girl, I was a real bookworm. I just always had my nose in a book, and it's just across from where my grandparents' cottage was. I used to spend hours sitting under this tree just reading books. And I was driving home from town there a few weeks ago, and there was a rainbow just over this tree. So I stopped and took a picture. But like, that tree must be 200 or 300 years old. It's like huge. You couldn't get your arms around it. It's so huge. And I just love to hear the stories that, they could tell, and what they saw during their lifetime. I mean, could you imagine? I love hearing
sit with it,
stories.
Sandie. You can do it. You just like you tune into your other abilities. Just sit with that tree and visualize its energy just kind of encompassing you. And before you know it, you're going to get downloaded information, however it comes to you. You can connect with anything. It's really just tuning into that radio station, so to speak, and
I
just
definitely
really
need to try that more. And I will now that you've said it, because I would just love to know, because I suppose my grandparents lived across the road. My granddad used to work on that particular farm, and I'd love to just hear what was seen and everything, and it would just be so lovely. So I'm definitely going to try that now over the summer. If summer ever arrives in Ireland, we've had the most awful rain over the last few days. So I'm waiting for summer to arrive.
I hear ya. And what really speaks really strongly too is the moss, which you have a lot of there in Ireland.
Yeah.
And so if you see moss, just connect. Oftentimes I use my left hand. For some reason, they guide me, because this is the receiving side, our feminine energy, our receiving hand. They'll switch. If I put my right hand, because I'm mostly dominant, I'm actually ambidextrous, but I'm mostly dominant right hand. I'll hear in my head, use your left hand. It's more feminine. It's more receptive. Wow. So I'll put my left hand on, say, a big boulder with moss, and immediately I feel a flood of energy coming through. And then I get my clear audience kicks in, and I start hearing, we are the guardians of the land. We're, all of this information comes through. And so all of this started to teach me I'm what's known as a grid worker. I travel around. My whole life I've traveled, and I connect with the land. I activate the land. The land activates me. And so, we all have these abilities. It's just, what radio station are we tuning into, right? You're clearly tuning into the deceased, and you're picking up on a lot of that energy too, which I did when I worked with the deceased. And now it's like living in the forest or around it. I'm tuning in to the elementals and the forest people and whatnot. So it's really just setting your intention and saying, okay, I'm ready to experience this. And before you know it, you will.
I should, because I totally get what you're saying, because I do it a lot. I mean, I live in Ireland. We have a lot of old castles. There's a castle. There's a castle in the field at the back of my house, just beside the ferry fort. There's one just down the road. Like, we have a lot of castles around. And, whenever I tend to go into an old building, I touch the walls to see what I get.
So
even if you're living in a city, right? I say this to all of my mediumship students: go to an antique store.
Oh God, I can't. I get so overwhelmed.
Yeah. Yeah. You have little bits in there. You just hold it. They have little, mirrors and combs from dressing tables, even the dressing tables itself, the dining tables. Just put your hand on it and feel it. When my son was little, my son is 15 now, but when he was little, I took him to a place. We have a place in Ireland called Clonmacnoise. You know, it's not far from another castle, but it's not far from Shannon Airport, actually. And it's where the first settlers that came to Ireland thousands of years ago lived, but it's still intact. You can go and visit there. So we went one day at the beginning of the season. It was really quiet. He was about, I think, 6 or 7 at the time. And we just sat in one of the huts. We call them huts because that's what they are. And I just said to him, you know, I said, can you feel anything or can you see anything? And he just said, only the woman cooking the food, you know, as if it was perfectly normal, you know. And so I love bringing him to old places. Back in 2019, before the pandemic, it was my last trip on an airplane before the pandemic. We're going away this summer though. But we went to Belgium for a holiday, and we went to Flanders, and we saw a lot of the you know, the graveyards and also the trenches from World War One. So we were in one of these trenches, walking through the trenches, seeing where, you know, the battles happened and everything. And they have these dugouts, you know, where they used to sleep and where they used to treat the wounded and everything. And, you know, Charlie, of course, would walk on ahead of us. This was only like 3 years ago, so he was only 12. So he used to walk on ahead of us, and he'd dip in and out. And he came out of one of these dugouts, and he was pale. And I said, are you okay? And he said, oh, there's a man in there. And I think I thought he just got a fright because there's a tourist in there. And I said, it's probably just somebody else visiting or whatever. So we went down, and there was nobody in there. He saw a spirit, and he described the man, and he described the uniform and everything. So at the end, after you walk through the trenches, as you're leaving, you go through the museum. And they have it was actually a German site that we were at. So it was one of the German trenches. And they had some of the old uniforms that they used to wear. And he said that was what the man was wearing. So, you know, like, bring your kids to these places, bring them to the old buildings, bring them to, you know, where things happened. And, you know, in the States, you have lots of, you know, Native American
big time
sites, which are amazing to visit, you know. So bring them to these places, especially if they've shown any indication of picking up any kind of energy. Bring them to these. There's my Irish accent coming out now. When I stop pronouncing my THs, my Irish accent starts to come out. So yeah, bring them along, and you know, they will just pick up so much, and they will be able to tell you so much.
Absolutely.
You know, but I'm definitely going to try the trees and the moss. Yeah, I love that idea.
Yes. And, you know, when I drive through the reservations, I start speaking, like, language comes through me, and I'll start tuning into the language. And Sandie, when I traveled in my 30s, I traveled to like 50 different countries. And my friend that I traveled with was a chaplain at the time. So she was dragging me into all these old churches. And I wanted to do the castles, you know, that was more my jam. Yeah. Well, I was like, fine, I'll do the churches with you, and then you'll do the castles with me. Well, every time I recognized going into these churches across Ireland, Sweden, Croatia, Italy, wherever, I would get really emotional. The moment I walked into the church, I felt like sadness, sorrow, pain, suffering, to the point I had to leave the church many times. And so my clairsentience was so strong. And I knew, you know, now looking back, I know I was cleansing the land. I was doing a lot of transmuting, because that's what I do. I was shifting energy in some of these places. But at the time, she was like dousing me with holy water. Like, what's wrong with you? You can't be in the church. But I was picking up on so much pain and suffering in these really, really old churches, because the churches here in the States, they're old, but nothing like in Europe or Ireland. I mean, these are ancient places. And so I agree with you. Take your children to these places, but listen to them. If they feel weird or they feel off, listen to them, you know, walk out of the space or whatever it is, because kids are even more in tune. This is, like I said, I was in my 30s when I was doing this, but children they could be having every single sensory going on. I was just feeling it, let alone, you know, seeing it, hearing it, tasting it, feeling
But it can have a huge effect. You know, even people don't realize. I mean, you know, I've been to New York where the Twin Towers used to stand. And obviously, I mean, we know a lot of what went on in these places. So, you know, but I did feel sick there. But not too far from where I live, maybe about 30 miles or so, there's an old prison. It's probably only about 200 years old. It's not that old. But there's a famous story here about two brothers that were imprisoned there. But one of the rooms that we went into, like, the guide was just showing us around, and one of the rooms that we went into, all of a sudden I just vomited. You know, I just said, oh my God. And he was like, what's wrong? I think he thought I might have been pregnant or something. And I was like, no. And so I had to leave the room. And you know, when I left the room, I sat down for a minute, I started to feel better. I said, there's something about that room. I said, there's something bad in that room. And this is where the two boys were kept in their last hour before they were hung. So it was their nervous energy. So you're going to pick up on things like that in old buildings. And it's just amazing, you know. And I would say to people, don't read up on where you're going first. You know, now it was very hard not to know about 9/11. The whole world knew about 9/11, you know. But, you know, I did a, you know, the words just evades me. You know, I did an overnight stint, you know, looking for ghosts. I can't remember what they call it, in a castle, which is not that far from where
paranormal tour. Yeah, paranormal investigation.
Yeah. But so I was invited to come, and I didn't know where I was actually going until, you know, I was brought there. So I didn't get to do any research on the place or anything, but I wouldn't have wanted to anyway, because I prefer to know what I pick up. But like, so at the end of the night, we met the custodian of the castle, and, you know, everything that I was able to tell her, she was able to verify that this had happened, you know, even down to a fire that had taken place in the 13th century. Wow. Because, you know, most of the castles would have originally been built in timber, and then they would have burnt down because the candles would have fallen over and whatever, and then they were rebuilt in stone. So I didn't know anything about the history of this castle, how old it was or whatever. And, you know, it's still a castle that's used today. You can hire it. Like if you're coming to Ireland on holidays, a lot of, you know, American families would hire out the castle to stay in for their holiday. And yeah, so I picked up on so much stuff. So you're better off not knowing the history of something and see what you can get and check it out afterwards, because otherwise it's your mind can play tricks, and you can think, well, I know that this happened here, so let me see if I can pick up on it, you know. So you're better off not to know. If you want to test yourself, you're better off not to know.
That is such good advice, Sandie. It really is. And oftentimes when you're in tune to that, you're going to pick up on it regardless. And, you know, that's been my experience. I walked into an old cemetery once, and I kept hearing, you know, just, I'm Sandie, I'm Joe, I'm Gus, I'm blah, 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 blah. And I had to say, stop it. Like, I'm in the middle of a cemetery. Yeah. Be quiet. And I sat down. I saw there was a huge statue of Jesus, and I just sat under it. And I said, okay, who needs to go to the light? Like, who's, you obviously are coming to me for assistance, and it's overwhelming. And I said, who needs to come? So I called in Archangel Michael, and then boom, it just got quiet, and I could hear the birds again. And so I think sometimes too, when you walk into those spaces, you're caught off guard by it. I know I am. It's like, I'm just on a leisurely walk. Next thing you know, I'm being bombarded by all of these voices.
Yeah, 100%. And I love it. I remember when I was a teenager, and I stopped telling people that I saw and you know, heard stuff and felt stuff, because I didn't want to be weird. So I have a cousin that I grew up like a sister with. Her father and my mother are brother and sister. And, you know, if I wasn't at her house, she was at my house. We were always at each other's houses. So she said to me one night, she said, Sandie, I need to tell you something. She said, I think there's something wrong with me. And I was like, you know, what's wrong? And she said, I hear people, she said. And I went, well, thank God for that, because I see them. I see them.
You know? You're like, great, we make a great duo. I've got a friend who she feels real. I feel, and she really feels. She's Lakota Native American. And she's like, I wish I could hear. I go, sometimes I wish I could. I do. I have to say, turn it down. It's distracting. Yeah.
And I always say to people, if they've seen the movie Ghost with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore, like when Whoopi Goldberg's character, once she starts letting spirit in, she's inundated, and it can be like that. You know, you do learn to control it. But I definitely feel, and I don't want anybody who's listening to think, you know, that just because you're not Native American or Irish, or, you know, that your grandmother wasn't a medium, that you can't connect with anything. Of course you can. You just need to learn how to open your energy and the signs to look for. You know, what are you looking for? And what I say to people when they ask me that question, like, how do I do this? What do I do? So the first thing, we've all heard about sitting in the power of spirit, right? Mm-hmm. But one thing that people always forget is to sit in their own power. And that's the best piece of advice that I could give to anybody. And what I mean by that is, every morning when you wake up, own what's yours. Okay. So even just when I'm brushing my teeth, I don't have time to give, you know, I'm getting kids out the door and everything in the morning. I don't have time to like sit and think, oh my God, do I have a pain in my toe today? But just even while you're brushing your teeth, think like, what belongs to me today? Do I have a headache? Do I have a pain in my back? You know, do I have a toothache? Because it's the
Is it
difference
mine?
between, yeah, exactly. Is it mine? And that's exactly what you're registering. Because, you know, if I have a headache on a particular day, you know that if you're reading somebody for spirit, you can't take painkillers because you're going to stop your feeling. And, you know, a lot with me is about clairsentience. So I have to say, okay, well, that headache is mine. So then later on that day, if I'm connecting with someone, maybe, for example, who died of a brain hemorrhage, they're going to have to give me that in a different way. Because I'm saying to spirit, okay, well, I have a headache today. You can't show it to me that way. You're going to have to give me something different, you know? So and it's the difference between how you felt, you know, before the reading and what you're feeling in the reading or in the presence of spirit or in this special place. That's the difference. The difference between the two is what you're getting from spirit.
Oh,
so
that's
it's
powerful.
it's always important to know, sit in your own power.
It is. And I think as intuitives, that is such crucial information, Sandie. Thank you for sharing that, because I know when I first realized I was highly empathic, I was just hurting all the time. I was working around death. I was around people who had suffered brain injuries. I had all of these. I was in a hospital. My whole body ached, and I didn't realize that I was being communicated with a lot of the time. That, you know, a portion of that, yes, was mine, but a large portion of it was just the energies around me. And now I do that. I wake up in the morning. Okay, how do I feel? Now I go do a little shopping. I've got a pain in my side. Okay, who's this lady standing next to me and what's going on with her?
Thank you.
Yes.
That's exactly it. Yes.
Yes.
Whatever else you pick up from other people. And, you know, when you're learning, you're going to make mistakes. And, you know, I have a relative who passed after a motorcycle accident. He was just 31 years old. And I was only a teenager when he passed. I was only 15. And I had spent that whole week with him preparing the bike for the race, you know. So I kind of blamed myself. So 10 days after he passed, he came back to me and showed me what happened, because I thought, did I do something wrong? Did he ask me to do something and I forgot to do it or whatever? You know, as a teenager, you're going to think, not that as a 31-year-old, he would have double checked everything that I was going to do anyway. But I didn't see that when I was 15. And he actually died just 10 weeks after my granddad died. My granddad died, then I had my birthday, and then Kevin died. And you know, he came through to show me it. And I think this is so important because over the years, you know, I remember the first time I stood up in front of an audience of people. It was only about 20 or 30 people. And my nerves, you know, it was a good few years ago now. I was so nervous. And the first person that came through was someone who had been killed in a motorcycle accident, and all this information. He was only 32 and all this. And I thought, okay, well, this is actually my relative coming through. I said, the age is a bit out, but he wasn't far before his 32nd birthday when he died. And I said, this is for me. And the lady that was with me, she said, no, it's not. Tell people what you're getting. And somebody else's brother had actually died in a motorcycle accident at the same age. Yeah. So, you know, I'm saying my point in this is everybody's going to make mistakes. Everybody's going to think, well, you know, this is for me, or this is my own. I'm developing a pain in my back, or all of a sudden I've got a headache, whatever. Just think about it a little bit more, okay, and see. And acknowledge, like, you could be in a queue in a supermarket, you know, waiting to pay for your groceries or whatever. And, you know, all of a sudden, as you say, you get a pain in your side or a pain in your head or a toothache or something. And then when you leave, it's gone.
It's gone.
Because you've been picking that up from somebody else.
Happens to me all the time, all the time. And sometimes I'm guided to say something. Sometimes I feel like I can't walk out of the store without saying, hey, do you have a pain in your hip, or what's going on, or what? And then there's times I'm like, no, I'm not being guided to say anything. It's only been a handful of times I've felt guided, but they're like, actually, yeah, I am. And so then I tune in to what emotion could that be trapped, or what information do they need to know? Or it's just really strange how it takes place.
I would never do that. And, you know, it's really, I'd love to.
I wouldn't want to do it either. It's just sometimes I'm being pushed.
No, but I think it's great. And I think the majority of people would appreciate it. And I love, there's an American medium called Teresa Caputo. I don't know.
Oh, I love her. Yeah.
Yeah. I love watching her shows. But like, you would never do that here in Ireland. You would never walk up to somebody and say, oh, you know, there's someone standing up. Now, I did it a couple of times. I was buying stuff when I was decorating my house, and I said to her, man standing beside you, your husband. I said, he was very young when he died. And she was like, what? And her husband had died and all this. But I remember doing it years ago. I was working and we were in the tea room at work, and I just turned to the lady beside me and I was like, who's this person? We'll say the name is Danny. I can't remember what the name was. I said, who's this person? I said, because it's his birthday today. I said, but he said he's here for you. And she was like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. And I kept going, I was young and I was idealistic, and I kept going, and she threw her cup of coffee at me. And I was like, okay, then I'm cuckoo. But somebody said to me afterwards, she had actually had a baby by that name who was stillborn on that date.
Oh.
So, but, in Ireland, we're coming around now. I say we because I'm Irish, but, the town that I live in, this was where all the Roman Catholic priests used to be trained for many, many years. So when I went to convent school for 13 years. And every morning when I was going into school, you would see about 800 to 1,000 student priests processing across the road from the college to the cathedral for morning mass. So this wasn't a town where you talked about seeing dead people or hearing dead people or having spiritual things, happen. So, it's just not in us yet to stop somebody on the street and say, oh my God, I know that so-and-so is with you.
Yeah.
But I do hope that we get somewhere near that, But like when you watch something like Tris Computer, I love it. But you've got a whole week's worth of filming, diluted down to 20 minutes. It's not every time you meet somebody, obviously.
Exactly. And so, like I said, that's happened to me very minimal. And it's only because it nags to the point where I know it's information that would be beneficial to that person. It's not, I hate having to say something. It feels very awkward and weird to have that conversation with someone.
It does.
But usually there's some sort of a leeway into it. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to scare somebody. Like I was telling somebody recently that I had a few years ago now, I had somebody come to my house to connect to a father who had passed, and the father came through and we spoke to him and everything. That was grand. And the following night I had a dream where I got a message from that person's father, and I was like, this sounds bad. Do I, and I spent all day thinking, oh my God, will I ring? Will I tell this person? What will I do? And I just bit the bullet, and I was like, I'm really sorry. And I'm so sorry to ring you and disturb you. And I really shouldn't be doing this. I don't know what I'm doing, but, and I gave this person a message. So in short, basically the father had come through to tell me to ring his son and tell him not to let his mother down that weekend. Oh. Okay. And he said to me, he said, I was supposed to bring my mother shopping on Saturday. He said, but I've been offered overtime at work and I really could use the money. And I said, look, I don't want to tell you not to take the overtime if you need the money. I said, I really felt like I needed to give you this message. I said, please do with it what you feel is right. I'm only a messenger. So he thanked me anyway, and I think he thought I was cuckoo, I'll be honest with you. But he rang me back the following Monday, and he said to me, Sandie Byrne, he said, I will never be able to thank you. Oh. He said, I didn't do the overtime, he said, and I took my mother shopping on Saturday. And his mother did not wake up on Sunday.
Oh.
She passed in her sleep on Saturday night. So I was
so
banshee?
Glad. Did you hear the banshee?
No, his dad actually came to me in my sleep. And I don't know why he didn't give the message during the session, but he came to me in my sleep that night. And I just said, okay, I have to tell him this. But I couldn't force him not to take the overtime, because if you need money, you need money. We all know what that's like. Eh?
Of course.
So yeah. So like things will happen and you will feel something and you'll acknowledge it. But it's not as simple as just stopping somebody on the street and saying, I see somebody beside you.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we want to shut it down. That happened to me too, Sandie, where I worked with organ donors. That's what I did. I worked in organ donation. Wow. And I had this really beautiful family that their son had passed. He had a head injury. And I had connected very deeply with his family. And that night, the deceased son had come to me in a dream with some very vivid information. Well, at this time, I wasn't really privy to my intuitive abilities. I was not really, I just thought it was a dream. Yeah. Well, a year goes by and we had an event for all of our families. And I had actually connected with the mother at this event. And I had nonchalantly shared with her my vivid dream the night after his passing, and her eyes welled up with tears. And she's like, Tanya, I needed that information. That was information that was so crucial to her. And at the time I was thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't even know I was holding on to some information for a year that was very meaningful to her. And had I known at that time, I don't even know if I would have shared that information had I known I was highly intuitive at that time. I just had nonchalantly, and I don't even know what kind of nudged me to share that I even had a dream, about him, but it had something to do with a key, and it was very specific, really. And so I think too, spirit talks to us in the dream state, and if we stuff it down, oftentimes it is information that may be valuable or useful to someone else, even though it's uncomfortable for us to share, right?
Yeah, and that's why I say to parents, listen to your kids. I don't care if they're adult kids or, toddler kids, listen to them, because as I was saying, Kevin came to me 10 days after he passed. And because I was so hung up on how the accident had happened, he showed me frame by frame what he saw, through the accident in my dream that night. And so the following morning, I was able to tell my mother, and my mother wouldn't let me go to the scene of the crash because she thought it was too upsetting. I was only a teenager. I understand that now. I didn't at the time. But so I was able to tell her what had gone wrong. There was a particular nut that was missing from the brake lines that caused air to get into the brake lines. So he had no brakes. So I told her that the following morning. So this was like 11 days after his crash. So it was another 15 months before the inquest was held. And it was 15 months of investigations. They came up with the same theory that I had told my mother the 11 days later.
See, you knew.
So sometimes we just, like you with your dream about that young boy that died, sometimes you just, and you don't know how relevant it is. I thought he was only telling me this because he needed to put my mind at rest that I hadn't done anything. But it was obviously more than that. But at 15, I didn't get it then. I get it now, but I didn't get it then.
So going back to what you said in the beginning, just say it, right?
But I say that too, because I want people who are developing, as mediums or as empaths or whatever, I want them to be comfortable with what they get and be comfortable with being wrong. And, even when you were talking, all of a sudden this memory came back to me. I haven't thought about this for a long time, but I remember reading about reading for a man who lost his son. And I had said to him that I thought that his son was parachuting. And I said, he was parachuting. I said, but I think he landed in the sea. And, I was talking about this and how he felt. And I said, it really doesn't make sense to me. But he said, it makes sense to me. Go on, say what you're feeling. So everything made sense, except that I thought he was parachuting. As it turned out, his son was a diver. And he had, I don't understand what it's called, the bends. It's something that happens.
The bends, it's when you go underwater and then you come up too fast, too much. Yeah, yes, I think nitrogen,
exactly.
CO2.
And so when I thought he was in a parachute harness, he was actually being winched from the sea.
Oh.
And this was what I was picking up. So I say this to people because they think that, when they listen to you or I, that we're perfect. We're not. We're going to get things wrong. We get the gist of it or we can feel it, but like diving is not on my radar.
Exactly. Okay, it's based off of our experience. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I live on an island. Okay. I totally get that I live on an island, but I can't even swim. Okay. The sea scares me. But I should say the ocean because we're in the middle of the ocean.
Well, the ocean in Ireland kind of scares me too.
Yeah, absolutely.
It looks
but
mean.
People think that just because you live on an island, that you do lots of water sports. I don't. But so this was not on my radar. It's not something else. Somebody comes to me and they died in a motorcycle accident. I got that. I've got that covered. I know everything to know about it, right? But, diving was just not on my radar. But parachuting, skydiving, yes, I understood that, which is why I took it for a harness. So exactly what you said, it's based on our experience, and for me, okay, like I don't want to say great success. Is that the right term to use when connecting? But I have had a lot of connection with children. Because personally, I've lost 6 babies. Okay, I do have 2 living children, and they're my world. But we always think the what if, don't we? So I've lost 6 babies, and I have connected with so many babies, whether miscarried, stillborn, died as toddlers or whatever. I also used to work in education. I used to work in a college, anybody from 17 years up, but a lot of young adults, obviously. And, in working in that environment, unfortunately, you see a lot of suicide. And in Ireland, we see a lot of suicide. So, I connect a lot with suicide victims, or with young people who have died, because that's my life experience, you know. So, you know, what your experience is, you know, you will excel at that. You know, you will, because you understand it and you get it totally, you
And
know.
I've talked
So
about that.
diving,
Yeah, before. I think where our energy goes, our attention goes, our energy flows, right? So when I was working in
yes.
death for 20 years, I was having a lot more experiences than I do now because I've been out of it for 5 years. But it's because I was in that vibration, I was in that frequency. It just was, I was resonating, you know, with it. And then once I kind of stepped away from it, now it's like, okay, I'm having completely different experiences than I was before. It doesn't mean I don't have those abilities still. They're still there.
Oh,
It's just,
100%.
mhm.
And I also want to ask you, because that's your experience, but, you know, people always ask me, okay, you know, when someone dies, do you feel energy off their body? And I always say no, because I don't. Because once they leave their body, I feel they've left it. And, you know, I'm more likely to pick up their energy maybe in their home or in my home, or, you know, something like this, or something that we've shared together. You know, if I want to connect with my granddad, it was actually his anniversary during the week, and I did go in and leave some flowers on his grave, but I actually went for a walk where he used to take me picking daffodils when I was a little girl. And I felt him more there out in the woods, you know, nobody around, just me and the flowers. And I talked to him and I had a really good conversation with him. So it's those places where I feel people's energy more, not necessarily from their bodies or farther from their graves. So I just wonder about that with you, when you said that, you know, you grew up in a funeral home and whatnot. Like, did you pick up energy from the bodies, or is it like that, their belongings more, or
No.
whatever? No.
Yeah. And it was my uncle who ran the funeral home, and I would go visit from time to time. And I wasn't picking up from the bodies. I was picking up from the home, the funeral home.
Yes.
I was picking up, and even in the hospital, these were old hospitals I was working in. I was picking up the energy in the hospital itself, not necessarily from the person. Now, with that said, like, I had that dream, which was specifically from a person, but yeah, I think more I tune into the land, the energy of the building, the energy of the land. And that's why I said, I joked about thrift stores. I go in there and it is like, immediately I walk in, I feel, hear, sense everything, and I walk right out. I'm like, whoa, that is, it's like sensory overload for me. Sometimes I start itching, all these things start happening. It's kind of wild.
You can get different things, but the majority of the time, I would say predominantly it's positive.
Yes.
You know, except when, and, you know, I need to explain to people as well, when I talk about, you know, being at 9/11 and being, you know, in prison, you know, in the room where people were held before they were hung, and that, you're not picking up necessarily their energy. But, you know, the room can hold on to the energy of what happened in it. So even when I did that paranormal investigation in the castle, okay, I did pick up a little boy who had died in the fire, okay? And everybody thought, well, he's there forever. No, he's not. He's not there forever. But the energy of what happened in that room is imprinted. It's like a footprint.
Yes.
It doesn't necessarily mean that that person is there and forever trapped in a fire. It's not necessarily negative. Yes, what happened to them, without doubt, it's negative, but they don't forever live that experience. They move on from it. So, you know, it's like
a fractal, like a little fractal of their energy that's still
absolutely.
there.
And, you know, you'll get this as well. You know, when you have spirit coming through to somebody and they're connecting and you're talking, you're passing on messages. And sometimes I cry because, you know, being clairsentient, if the spirit's crying, I'm crying. But I always have to explain to people, this doesn't mean they're unhappy in the spirit world. This means they're emotional to be faced with you today.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, it's just their emotion coming to the surface. It's just that they're so happy and they don't know what to say. And, you know, they don't want to say goodbye. So it's a moment in time. Okay. But we can't judge a lifetime by a moment. And, you know, I have to say to people, don't concentrate on how somebody died. I spent so many years concentrating on how Kevin died that I forgot about how he lived.
Yeah.
And we did have him for 31.5 years, you know, and like that was a huge thing for me. You know, Kevin, although technically he was my uncle, he was raised, you know, we were raised with him. He was like my big brother, and, you know, we were very close. So, you know, I forgot for a long time about how he lived. And we have a lot longer with them living than we do with them dead. So don't concentrate about how they died, you know, concentrate on how they lived, because that's going to be your connection with your loved ones.
Yes.
And that's what's important. That's what brings them back to you time after time after time. It's the love that you shared, because the love hasn't died. Just because their physical body died doesn't mean that the love has died. So
That's
your
so true.
relationship with them changes. It doesn't die. It just changes. Yeah, it's so important for people to know that, because everybody's grieving someone, you know. I'm in my 40s now. We don't get to this age without, having lost someone or known someone who's passed over. And just remember how they lived and the relationship you had beforehand, because that's what's important.
It
And
is.
that's what keeps the energy going when you're connecting. It's harder, and I'm sure you will agree that it's harder with your own loved ones than it is with somebody else's, because you have nothing to prove to somebody else. Whereas when you know everything about your own loved ones, it's harder. Like, I know that Kevin used to lift weights and ride motorbikes, okay? But, if I went to a medium and they told me that Kevin lifted weights and rode motorbikes, I go, you're a brilliant medium, But I need him to prove more to me that, that he did this. So I need more information. I want to know that he wore red socks on a Sunday, and I want to know, what newspaper he read and all of this kind of stuff. So we all want, the information that's going to prove it to us. I still need proof. I'm probably the most skeptical medium that you ever met.
Hey, that's a good way to do it, because and I think this is a good way to end the show, Sandie, because this was perfect, because, it's really on a good highlight to, really cherish those moments that you have with your loved ones, and really remember them and honor them in a state of joy. I know for me, my 91-year-old grandmother passed a few years back, and I said, how are you going to show me in spirit that it's you? And she said, I'm going to make you laugh. And I said, okay. So now I know ladybugs were our thing. And so I went on a walk one time and I said, Grandma, it was the day of her death, a year later.
Yeah.
I said, Grandma, show yourself to me. I want to see a ladybug. I said, one ladybug. Well, I'm telling you what, she showed me thousands and thousands and thousands of ladybugs.
Oh, I love that.
I was giggling and laughing. I could feel her energy around me. And so, like you said, it's hard for us when we think about the loss of our loved one, but if we can laugh and be in joy and think about all of the amazing memories, what it does is it raises your frequency, and then it helps you become more in tune with them. And it really just brings their presence closer to you. And you can feel it when my grandma's around. It's almost like she's sitting, I don't see her, but I can feel her with every cell in my body. It's like she's sitting right there next to me, and she'll show me.
And don't be afraid.
Ladybug on my pants,
Like when you asked your grandmother, I would say to people, don't be afraid to ask them.
Yeah, they're waiting.
Oh, 100%. My father-in-law, he really believed in spirit world and the afterlife. My husband was a bit on the fence about it, I'll be honest, okay? But my father-in-law passed suddenly about 5-6 years ago. Literally, he was just 65 years old and he died on his own in his apartment. God bless him. But on his first birthday after his passing, okay, we were here in the house. It was August. It was actually quite a warm day, which is unusual for Ireland. But anyway, our warm is probably your cold. But we had all the patio doors open and everything. And my husband was outside. And he was working on his motorbike. And this butterfly, he said, this effing butterfly, he said, it won't leave me alone. And, my father-in-law had always said, if I die, I'm going to prove to him that there's an afterlife. So I said to him, I said, that's your dad. And he said, nah. I said, put out your hand and say, Dad, if that's you, come and land on my hand. And he said, right. He put out his hand and he said, if this is you, Daddy, come and land on my hand. That butterfly came and landed on his hand and stayed there for over half an hour. So if you ask from spirit, you will receive. Okay. It may not be that immediately. Okay, I say give them 24 to 48 hours.
Yeah, they've got to work up the energy to manifest that, right?
Yeah, and they have to work it into our circumstances as well, what we're doing. I mean, there's no point in me asking, my grandmother to play a Dolly Parton song if I'm out walking in the woods. Do you know what I mean? Because she can, what's she going to do? Appear and sing it, But so they have to work it into what's going on around us as well. So I say give them 24 or 48 hours to give you that sign. But don't be afraid to ask for it, as long as you're thankful afterwards. Say thank you.
And be open to receiving that information, however it comes. Don't think, oh, it's going to come exactly this way. Just throw it out there and then allow yourself to receive it how it comes. Mm-hmm.
I love that. Yeah, no, it's so true. I could talk to you all day.
I could too, Sandie. And this has been such a fun show. Oh my gosh. I love the stories. I think I'm going to rename the show because we just had so many fun stories to share
Yeah,
about
absolutely.
our experiences. And that's what's, that's what's really exciting, is because, some people out there may be listening to this and they might be like, wow, I had that experience too, or something very similar. And I didn't realize that maybe
Absolutely.
that was spirit,
Or people that are on the fence about, whether they believe or not, they have to know what's possible.
Mhm.
And you don't have to go to a medium. You can watch a show on YouTube or whatever, see what's possible and see if you're drawn in that direction.
Mhm.
You may never be, but know what's possible, because there's so much more to this world than just going to work and paying a mortgage and whatever. There's so much more to this life, and once we know what's possible, then we really learn to live.
We do. And so, Sandie, can you
Mm.
share with us a little bit about the services that you provide and how people can connect with you?
Sure. So, like, I do a lot of different things. So, mainly I'm a psychic medium. So, I do psychic readings and mediumship readings. I'm sure your listeners already know the difference. But just very quickly, I always say to people, a psychic is someone who reads the energy of the living, and a medium is someone who reads the energy of the dead. Okay. So, I do psychic and mediumship readings. And I use my numerology as well. I'm also a numerologist.
Mhm.
So, I use my numerology as part of my psychic readings. But I also do, like, if someone's naming a baby or naming a business, okay, so I check that out using my numerology to see if it's a name for success or whatever. And yeah, and I teach mediumship as well. So I do different courses during the year where I teach people how to connect with energy. So it's all really around the psychic and the mediumship. I used to do a lot of healing. I'm also a healer. But I do that mostly in person, so it just hasn't been possible over the last few years. So I probably will get back into that pretty soon. But one thing that I do that's really cool, and isn't necessarily as welcome here in Ireland, but I did a show in Canada, in Toronto, in Canada, where I did where spirit come into your body. My vocabulary,
Channeling?
I think, is just leaving me
Channeling?
today. Channeling, yes, but where the spirit use your body. So, like when Patrick Swayze went into Whoopi Goldberg's body on the film Ghost. So I did a demonstration of that in Toronto, and they loved it. But it's not so much done over here. So so that's something I'm hoping to get back over to the States now that travel is all open again.
Yes.
And get to do a few more shows and some more readings over there. So
well, if
yeah,
you're ever
sorry,
in the Pacific Northwest, let me know, because I'll come see
I
your show.
definitely will. 100%. And you have to come back to Ireland.
I
You
just got my
definitely do.
passport. I just got my passport in the mail. I had to renew it. And I'm like, all right, I'm ready.
Yeah.
I've got a whole clear book here
You did.
of travel.
I actually met a group that was over from Canada. They were over from the Vancouver area.
Yeah, that's my side. That's where I am.
Oh, that's
there.
your side.
Mm-hmm.
So they came over on an angel tour. So they came over to see some of the sites of Ireland to try and, connect about fairies and stuff and whatever. So I met them and we talked about some spirituality and answered all their questions about spirituality while they were over here. So like, there's so many tours that come to Ireland as well. Don't ever be afraid to, hop on one and come over. And, I meet up with some of them, and it's just so powerful. And I'm learning something new too, because I had never worked with the angels before. Mm-hmm. But, we did some angel meditations and stuff, and I just get it now, but I think the time is right. The time wasn't right before now, but, the time is right now for me to try new things. But, I'm very bad. I tend to stick with what I know I can do. And I'm one of those people who, I don't know, is it an Irish thing, but I'm kind of like, okay, I don't think I'll try that because I don't think I can do it, rather than pushing myself. But tomorrow I am going to be out talking to trees. I'm telling you that now.
The moss and the boulders.
The moss on the trees. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
I can't wait to hear about your stories. You're like, they told me this and they told me this.
Yeah, I can't wait. Thank you so much for having me, Tanya. And I'm sorry that I talked for so long. I love it. Stone.
You brought your beautiful Irish storytelling to the show, and I love that. Yeah. And it pulled out my storytelling, and I love that. And so, Absolutely. Our original intention was, to talk about all these different, I had sent you some questions, but you know what? I love the flow, and maybe that's why we weren't connecting on Tuesday and why we connected today. And I love the flow of the show. Thank you for sharing all your stories. Thank you for being vulnerable. I know some of those stories were hard to share about your friend and about losing your children. And, so thank you so much, Sandie, for the energy that you're putting out into the world.
Welcome.
for what
It's
you brought to
amazing.
the show today.
Thank you for having me, Tanya. Take care.
You deserve to navigate your life in alignment with health, happiness, and abundance. To learn more about the services that I provide, including Beyond Quantum Healing Hypnosis, EFT tapping, and the Emotion Code, visit my website at www.theexistentialempath.com.